Welcome to the Horological Society of New York. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the president, and it's very nice to see everyone here tonight. We've got a lot of announcements before we move on to the main lecture, so bear with me as we get through some of these announcements. Happy New Year, of course. Welcome to 2018, which is HSNY's 152nd year. That's quite something. 2018 is going to be a wonderful year for the Society. We've got lots of surprises in store. And I think we're starting things out with a very positive note tonight with our speaker for the evening. I have some sad news before we get started. Hans Weber passed away this past weekend, Saturday morning. Hans was the most senior member of our society. He was an active member for over 50 years. He was the only person that attended both the 100th anniversary in 1966 and the 150th anniversary in 2016. He was a kind man. He was a talented watchmaker, and he will be missed. His funeral service is this Saturday in New Jersey, and the details are up now on our website. Okay. On to some news of a different sort. If you remember at the last meeting, at the December meeting with Roger Smith, I was really excited because I was announcing an expansion of our scholarship program. We were going to double it from one scholarship of $5,000 to 2 scholarships. And so I announced that. There were quite a few watchmaking students here. And then the next day, after Roger's lecture, the Horological Society received an anonymous donation of $100,000. And this donation, it came with the instructions to put it all towards our scholarship program. So we had our December board meeting, and I'm very happy to announce tonight that instead of doubling our scholarship for 2018, we're going to quadruple it. So we're going to give 2 scholarships of $10,000 each. And like I said at the December meeting, we're going to continue doing everything we can to expand the scholarship program in the years to come, because we know it makes a difference, and we know we want to support American watchmaking students in every way possible. So I know I see a few watchmaking students here in the crowd tonight. Make sure to start writing your application letter right now. The application period is now until March 1st, and please let your classmates know as well. We're looking forward to a big pool of applicants this year, and we're going to be awarding the scholarships at the annual gala in April. And this is a new photo of Henry B. Freed teaching a watchmaking class in Brooklyn, and this is courtesy of Miss Carol Feldman, who's the daughter of Henry B. Freed. So we thank Miss Feldman for her support of the scholarship as well, and we especially thank the anonymous donator who made this possible. It was really an amazing surprise, and we're looking forward to really making a positive difference as we go forward in 2018 and the years to come with our scholarship program. And we have a new sponsor that's I'm very happy to announce tonight. That sponsor is Watchonista. Watchonista.com is an amazing journalistic, horological website. I encourage you all to visit. And we have some representatives from Watchonista here tonight. Very, very happy to include Watchonista as a new sponsor for the Horological Society. Thank you for all of your support. I'm also very happy to announce we have some changes to our team. There we go. We have some changes to our team for this year. You can see our team is growing. We have, I think, over 20 people now from the officers' side of things and the staff side of things. You'll see everyone there, and the people that are in bold are the new officers and staff for 2018. So I think we have some of the people here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and embarrass you while I have the chance. So we have Ryan Jewell, who's now the director of fundraising. Ryan, could you stand up? We'll give you a hand. We have Ed Heidman, who's now taking on the role of executive director. He actually started this in 2017, but he's really just picking things up right now, and he's doing an absolutely wonderful job with it. Ed is at home tonight with the flu that has been going around the city. Ed, we wish you well, and sorry you can't be here with us tonight. Brett Walsdorf also joined the officers as a trustee this year. I believe Brett is also out for the evening. Krista Chance is now our recording secretary. Krista is also out for the evening. And then last but not least, we have Luke Cox-Bien as our new vice president. And bear with me, I have a little bit of a story to tell about Luke. So when I started at watchmaking school, this was down in Miami, Florida, almost, what was this, 8 or 9 years ago. Luke and I went to the same school, and Luke was in the class ahead of me. He was in the senior class. And I remember the first morning of our class, I was nervous, so we were unpacking all of our boxes of tools, and Luke was the first person that came up to me and welcomed me and showed me some of the tools and got me comfortable with the class. And then fast forward, after watchmaking school, we both went our separate ways. I moved back to California, and then I eventually ended up back here in New York City. And when I moved to New York City, Luke was the first person to welcome me to New York City. And I remember we met up and we had coffee one afternoon, and he said, "Hey, you know what? There's this group, it's called the Horological Society. You should come check it out. It's lots of watchmakers just hanging out." And long story short, here we are. So Luke, I'm very, very happy to welcome you as the Vice President for 2018. Okay, and as always, any new members here, I know I passed out a few lapel pins earlier. If you have not yet picked up your lapel pin, please see me or Luke afterwards, and we'll make sure to get you your lapel pin. Traveling education. We're starting off the new year with a bang here as well. We'll be going to San Diego in early February for a weekend of education. And then in early March, we're headed to Chicago. So we're keeping things moving as we move into 2018. Look for many more cities throughout the rest of the year. If you know anyone in San Diego or Chicago, please let them know about our classes. They are online now, and tickets are available to book. And save the date. Our annual gala and charity auction is coming up April 18th, 2018. This is a Wednesday night. This is not Monday or Tuesday. It's a Wednesday night this year. It's going to be here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. If you haven't been to one of our galas before, it's not a lecture format. It's a big party with lots of great food, lots of drinks. We have a charity auction, and the lots that we have for our charity auction this year are just absolutely incredible. I cannot wait to tell everyone what those lots are, and I think that at the next meeting we'll be announcing all of the details about the auction. And also at the annual gala we'll be awarding our Henry B. Freed Scholarship. So it's a lot of fun, and early bird tickets are available right now. The gala is a fundraising event for the society, and right now you can grab your early bird tickets for $100 up until the end of the month, and then the price is going to increase. So I encourage you to all book your tickets right now for that. All right, we're ready for tonight's lecture. So earlier this year, I saw the news about this new website that was coming online. It's new platform for horological education that's called the Naked Watchmaker. And I was really excited about it for two very specific reasons. One, the mission of this website is really almost the same as the mission of our society. It's just pure education, and education of a horological nature. And two, the person behind it has extensive experience in the inner workings of the Swiss watchmaking industry, and he's now able to tell his story and give his perspective and explain some of the knowledge that he's built over the years from an entirely neutral and unbiased perspective. And this is something that's kind of rare to find these days. You know, as our industry gets more corporate, more bureaucratic, if you tend to work for a brand, you're going to stick with that brand's message. You can't really stray from the message. And so it's really refreshing to see a take on watchmaking and horological education that is neutral and unbiased from the start. So tonight we're going to take a look at the Naked Watchmaker. We're going to see how the website started, where it's at today, and what its goals are for the future. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the founder of the Naked Watchmaker, Peter Speake Marin.
When Nick invited me to give the lecture this evening to present my platform, I was expecting there to be something in the region of about 20 people here. My coefficient was well out, so thank you very much for everybody for having come this evening to listen to me make this presentation. Nick has already explained the motivation behind the Naked Watchmaker. The reason, or the motivation really began almost 30 years ago when I first went to WOSTEP, which is Watchmakers of Switzerland Training and Education Program in Neuchâtel. I was always driven to, or I always had the idea or the desire to forward watchmaking, to be able to share what I loved with a wider group of people. And I had moments during my career where I was involved in training. I helped different companies develop, and it was always this idea to be able to actually help people that was very much something which motivated me. Today, I'm putting 90% of my time into this project, and it is very much something which I have always wanted to do. I should also say that I'm a watchmaker. I'm not really a public speaker, so please bear with me. So, during my career, I started off in after-sales service. I went into restoration. Afterwards, from restoration, where I spent 6 years, I went to Switzerland and I worked in a company called Renault & Papy, building complications within Renault & Papy. I was involved in tourbillons, grand sonneries, repeaters, and eventually into product development. When I was in Sommelum Antiques in London, the catalyst for the Naked Watchmaker was actually born. The watch that you're looking at is a Patek made in about 1884. It was made for the Russian market. The dial is enamel. The case was made in 18-karat yellow gold. And all of the details on the dial were actually in Russian. I used to photograph the pieces as I took them apart, and then share that information through different magazines. It could have been International Watch, or it was the British Horological Institute. And the reason I did it was I was seeing things that nobody else would actually see. So I felt driven or motivated to share something that I loved with a wider group of people, wanting to show people things which they never, in fact, hardly anybody would ever actually venture to see, and very few watchmakers. With that particular watch, when I took off the dial, I saw what only a watchmaker sees, which is all of the quantum perpetual mechanism which you have underneath. And one of the things that I loved about it, or one of the things which drove me to photograph and then to share this material, was that everything that you see in this particular watch is synonymous with the same technology that was actually being used 100 years ago. But this is prior to CAD. It was actually prior to the Wright brothers even flying for the first time. When this watch was made, the invention of the motorbike had only been around for a few years. Yet the technology, the basic theory within it, was still being used 100 years later. The bridges are made from German silver. Everything was hand-finished. Everything was hand-designed. There was no CAD. All of the levers that you see, like the main operating lever, which is here, everything would have been made, finished, assembled, adjusted by hand. So that was one of the first pieces that I deconstructed, that I restored, and then I shared with people. And by fate, I still had the original material, and that is where I start, because that's really where the idea came from. The Naked Watchmaker has 6 categories, 5 categories of watches. There's a 6th category which will go into mechanical, other mechanical objects. Products by companies like Roland Eaton, but autonomous, which will also become part of the site in the future. I start with pocket watches because pocket watches are the beginning of horology, the beginning of watchmaking. This piece is a Girard-Perregaux. It's a very simple, classical watch made in around 1880. The dial is made from enamel, the hands are gold, the movement is entirely made from German silver, and to the right you have one of the elements which you find on every deconstruction, which is on the side, which is when the piece is fully dismantled, then I'll take a picture which will actually show a combination of all the different elements which are within the watch. One of the things, or probably the main aspect which I love about watchmaking, is that everything is a conception of a person. It's all about an idea which is made real. And beyond the actual idea coming from an individual, everything that you see, or majority of what I will show you, has actually been assembled by people, by taking time out of somebody's life, and along the way, there are things which were executed by the watchmaker to be able to actually facilitate the watchmaker's job in the actual manufacturing, the making process. Here, you have the backside of all of the bridges. When this watch was made, there would have been 5 or 6 pieces being made, assembled in parallel. Everything was done by hand, all the adjustments, all of the jeweling, all of the pivoting. So you couldn't have 2 pieces which were directly interchangeable. So the watchmaker stamped, and you can just see it here, he stamped on every bridge a number, the number correlated to that caliber. And again, the only person who gets to see that is a watchmaker. So when I take the pieces apart, I try to show people things that other people don't ever get to see, and is actually synonymous with the process of actually making these watches. This is a Jules Jurgensen. It was also made in just prior to 1890. It is an incredibly over-engineered piece of horology. It is a chronograph foudroyant. And I'll explain a little bit more in the next slide what a foudroyant actually is. But you have 2 trains. One side is for the normal goings train, and then on the other side you have for the foudroyant. You have a 5-minute repeater. These are the hammers that are here. And the chronograph is actually down at the bottom. Now, the foudroyant, okay. All that it effectively is the chronograph for foudroyant. It can record up to 1 minute. That's it, just 60 seconds. It doesn't go beyond that. And the bottom seconds will pulse 5 times per second. What the actual functionality, what the real reason for it, I have no idea. The military used to make these kind of things to actually calculate how long it took for a missile to be, from the moment a missile was actually launched to it would actually land. But this is German silver, enamel dial, 18-karat gold case. It wasn't made for the military, so no idea. But the time and effort and energy that went into this thing is extraordinary. You have two trains within the watch. The first train is simply to drive the watch for the timekeeping. The second one drives a second train, which ends here. And this section here is this wheel, this star wheel, which is here, is a second level, which is on top of the escape wheel, which is the last wheel in the going train. And those two pieces work together. The train to the right, which finishes in this small mobile here, as the escape wheel turns around, is then freed. And that's how you get the pulses. And the mechanism which is on top, this is the hammer, which will then come down and actually break on that pinion when the mechanism is actually stopped. Another element of this particular watch, which is not necessarily over-engineered, but is unique to this particular caliber, which I've never seen by any other brand. At the end of the 19th century, the whole process of making keyless work, watches which didn't require a key or even a pusher to be able to adjust the time, was in the process of being developed. With this particular watch, the way you set the time was that you would pop open the cover, you would then take the bow, which is up here, and then you would pivot it towards the center of the watch. As you pivoted it to the center, there was a cam set into the case, which would push on a small pin. The pin would in turn push on this lever, and then you would actually set the watch. It's obscure, it's unusual, and I have never seen it by any other brand, and if you don't actually know how the watch can be adjusted, it's quite curious. And a lot of people will actually, I've seen these watches broken by people trying to lever the crown out or to use other systems. But it's something which is one of those obscure facts which I find personally quite fascinating about watchmaking. The different solutions that were used by different people and different companies to overcome the same challenges. This is a minute repeater, Quantium Perpetual Patek Philippe. Same period as the previous two pieces, towards the end of the 19th century. Case is 18-karat gold, dial is made of enamel, hands would have been made in 18-karat gold. What is interesting about it is the movement was made by Audemars, not Audemars Piguet, but another Audemars. And Patek would have bought the caliber, and then on top of it, they had a Quantium Perpetual mechanism, which is the system that you have to the right here. And they used the same concept over 100 years ago that many companies use today when actually assembling different complications. And again, the actual system that you have here, this is the brain of the Quantium Perpetual. It is again the same system that is used by many Quantium Perpetual companies that are making QPs today. Another element which, again, only watchmakers see. This is from the Patek Philippe. These screws here, and this is with the movement removed from the actual case. These screws are the screws which hold the movement solidly inside of the case. When the movement is pushed into the case, they are pivoted. They clamp against the inner case, and they are limited by how far they can go by the amount of space which is underneath. So it's not rocket science. But when the pieces were being assembled, all of the adjustments would have been made by hand. And the watches had to be dismantled, they had to be cleaned, they had to be then decorated. So the watchmaker would then tap a number of marks. Sometimes there would be nothing, that would be for the first one. The second one would have just one simple dot stamped into the screw and into the side of the main plate. And then the third one would then have two marks in the screw and then two below. That was just to make the watchmaker's life easier when it actually came to the assembly. Again, it's not rocket science, but somebody took the time to do it to facilitate their job. And again, it comes down to the human element. To the right, you have the gongs. Again, made 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. The way that they were actually tuned was this is the foot, this is what is screwed down onto the movement. The gong comes out, and then the watchmaker would have taken a file, and today we tend to use diamond files to be able to cut away the hard steel metal to be able to actually tune it. It's exactly the same process that companies are using today. Following pocket watches, in the evolution, we have wristwatches. This is a ladies' Cartier cocktail watch, made in about 1920. The movement is signed EWC & Co., European Watch and Clock Company. The technical director was Jaeger Lecoute. At this point, Cartier were strictly jewelers. So they didn't want to use a movement made by another company, so they created this company, EWC. And then it was neutral, but it had high quality, and it was a high quality caliber. And it meant that there was a certain credibility behind the watches that they would make. All the movements were made in German silver, all of the bridges were hand finished, all of the engraving was made by hand. The cases were never water resistant. They were just screwed together by 4 screws on the side of the case. The actual glass was sandwiched between the dial and the bezel. Now, they weren't water resistant, but they did try to insulate them. So they would then place beeswax between the glass and the bezel to hold solidly in place the actual glass and to try to make it at least dust resistant in one level. Today, when the watches are actually restored, quite often we'll use different modern silicon and composites, which is more effective. But at the time, it was beeswax. This is a Rolex chronograph made in about the 1950s. One of the things which is interesting about it is that the movement is called it comes from a company called Valjoux, and this is a Valjoux 23. In the lifetime of Valjoux, and they today exist under the auspices of the Swatch Group, but everybody used this caliber. They were often personalized by the different brands. Here with the Rolex, they have their own shock protection, they have their own balance, they modified certain elements of the bridges, but intrinsically the movement remains a Valjoux 23. And I've forgotten what I was going to say. The Valjoux 23, made in the 1950s, was a predecessor of the 72. The Valjoux 72 was also used by many different companies. And one of them, probably the most beautiful, the most well executed, was actually made by Patek. Now, the reason I mention that is that this use of common calibers, or by generic calibers by different companies, has been used for hundreds of years. Companies would take a caliber which existed and then they would personalize it. It happened hundreds of years ago, even in the period of Tompion, and it's still being made today. And I go further into that later on in the presentation, and you can see modern calibers which are used by companies like Parmigiani, but can be used by other people such as Hermes or Richard Mille. So, with the Valjoux 23, you have a system called a pillar wheel. This is effectively the brain of the watch. As you activate the operating lever here to stop the piece, the pillar wheel turns around, and all the mechanism, all the levers around it, will then move to start, stop, or return to zero the watch. This is the pillar wheel, which tends to be synonymous with what people regard as high-quality chronographs. These are all the levers which are around it, which are affected by the pillar wheel. And the system, this is the chronograph wheel upon which the seconds hand, or the chronograph seconds hand, is fitted, and the minute recorder wheel. The hearts are part of the mechanism which allows the watch to be returned to zero. This is a Jaeger from the 1950s, a triple calendar. Jaeger, with this watch, made every part of it, from the hands, the dial, the case, the movement. But the actual watch, or the same watch, was also made by Cartier and by Vacheron Constantin. All of those brands were actually using the same production by Jaeger-LeCoultre. It's not a negative thing. It's just an interesting element in how different companies would use the same calibers, even the same styles. And you can find the identical watch, and it'll be signed Cartier, and it will be a Cartier, but it was made by Jaeger. Same with Vacheron. Vacheron would go further with the finishing, and the decoration would be much more ornate. This is the birth of the constellation. The Omega constellation is one of the classic timepieces. If you're a collector, somewhere in your collection, you'll most likely have this. And this was at a point when Omega, and they're doing it together today, but for a long period they stopped. This is when they were making every component. And the movement, as you see it, you could automatically tell it was an Omega at the time, the caliber, without seeing the case, without seeing another element, because they all had this like 5N red gold finish, which was on the movement. If you go to the site and you see this, you can actually see the whole history of the watch from its life. The certain elements always wore in this watch. This rotor isn't the same color as the rest of the movement. It was replaced at another period. The watch wasn't serviced for a very long period of time, and you can tell because around the periphery of the movement, material has been worn away from where the rotor has actually worn, and then it's actually touched, rubbed, and removed material from the rest of it. This can all be corrected, but they're just small things which, when a watchmaker opens up a watch, he can actually see what's happened to it and see what needs to be done and how it needs to be corrected. So we go from vintage into modern mainstream. So made in 1994, the Omega Speedmaster Professional. There's a lot of Omega here. That's just happenstance. It's not actually intentional. Okay, so when you remove the case back, the first thing that you see within the watch is a cap. The cap had two functions. Essentially, it was there to ensure that the watch remained anti-magnetic, so no magnetism could actually go through and affect the movement. When this was made, all of the balance springs were made from carbon alloy. They had different alloy balance springs, which could be magnetized, which was the case up until quite recently for the majority of balance springs. So the cover protected the mechanism from actually having any effects when the watch found itself in a magnetic environment. The second function of that cap was that it actually held the whole movement in place. There weren't any additional screws actually holding the movement and its movement ring in place. It was held in place by that cap, and the small button at the top actually pushed on the inside of the case back, pushing down on the whole of the movement assembly. This also has another system for the chronograph. Instead of having a pillar wheel, it has a cam system, which is here. In the next slide, you can actually see how it works. So when you do the start-stop here, there's a lever which pushes up. It pushes the cam system here, starting and stopping, and then you would have an additional pusher which is on the side of the watch here, which in one particular position would then allow you to return to zero the actual hands. Another element of the watch which you don't normally, or if you're not a watchmaker, you won't actually realize, are unusual screws within the actual mechanism. So here you have this screw is cut off. This is actually not a screw. It's called an eccentric plug. When you look on the back of it, you see that you have a pin or a pillar which is off center. And this allowed the penetration of the coupling clutch, the wheels of the chronograph mechanism, to be adjusted to a specific penetration so that the mechanism would actually run smoothly without any fluttering of a seconds hand, so that the seconds hand would start instantaneously without any jumps. When that kind of adjustment is conventionally done, it's effected using a microscope because the precision is incredibly fine. But it was done by hand, and that is one of the eccentrics that was used. This is the kind of penetration. go. The actual profiles of the teeth change. This is conventional, this becomes triangular. The reason for the triangular is so that when this lever actually moves in to engage with the chronograph hand in the center, there's a very smooth transition. If it isn't this kind of form, then you risk there being an impact or teeth up, the tip of two teeth landing on top of each other. By them being triangular, it would ensure that there was actually a smooth transition. Again, with all of the deconstructions that I make, when the pieces are actually finished, I make these like an exploded view of the pieces. The IWC Portuguese. What is interesting about this as a watch is that the basic caliber is a Valjoux 7750. And it was adapted by Richard Habring. Richard Habring is an independent watchmaker today. He makes his own timepieces. But this particular watch he designed and made when he was working for IWC nearly 25 years ago. He removed all of the automatic mechanism and he industrialized a split-second system which was very simple but really quite brilliant. It's something which I think he continues to use today, and he's taken it on to another level. Part of what I'm driven by, a part of what I try to share is the creativity of how people take different pieces, take different calibers, take different complications, and then modify them to bring extra value, to make things which are out of the ordinary. Arnold & Son was originally an English company. It was reinvented by a guy called Eric Loth in about 2006, I believe, something like that. And it's entirely made in Switzerland. The watch itself is actually really quite unusual. The basic caliber is called a Pezzo 9001. At least that's where the DNA comes from. That's where you have the basic design of the wheels, of the balance, of the escapement. But Arnold & Son took that caliber, added an additional barrel to it to extend the overall power reserve of the piece, and they took elements from early English watchmaking, such as in early English watches, the escaples would always have 3 arms. Very simple thing, but it defined the style of them. So Arnold took that particular design feature and then replicated it all over the watch. So they took something which has been around for over 60 years as a basic caliber, but then they actually modified it, changed it, added more originality into it. Independent brands, the next category. Within the independent world of watchmaking, every watch or every watch brand which exists is very much a representation of the individuals who are behind. And I list a few of them here. The McGonagalls, Stephen and John, 2 Irish boys, both worked in Neuchâtel, both of them for a company called Christophe Clary, and a number of years ago, they designed their own watches. The finishing, the quality, the overall execution of the pieces are beautiful. And one of the things which identifies them as being a McGonagall watch is the form of the balance bridge, which is here, which has this like eagle's head look to it. And all of the watches they make, that is one element which will automatically be identified as a McGonagall. Not a watchmaker, but an engraver, Kees Engelbart. Kees Engelbart specializes in very intricate hand engraving. He's worked a lot with mokomegami, which means like wood in Japanese, which is the material which you have behind the eagle. The actual design of the eagle at the top and the sparrow at the bottom was taken from a Japanese tsuba, the protective guard which you find on a samurai sword. He took that, integrated into the watch, and it's executed in multiple different kinds of different material of gold. This is something which he specializes in. It's something which he does. Each one that he makes is a unique piece. You'll never find 2 of the same design. The godfather of all independent watchmakers is probably Philippe Dufour. Philippe is he's respected by virtually every collector and every watchmaker in Switzerland. There's very few people who are actually as heralded as a watchmaker as Philippe. This is called the Simplicity. It's a very simple timepiece. It looks like a Calatrava in basic design, but every element of the watch is actually finished by hand. Now, in the same way that you have all those other pieces which are very high quality, finished by hand, and they have their own very special elements of originality within them, you have other companies. This is Claude Meylan. Claude Meylan took an early caliber made in the 1960s and 70s called a Unitas, took all the original components, and then remade all of the bridges, the main plate, to be able to make something which was different. So it is not on the same kind of price range as all of the other watches that I've just shown you, but it is something which actually has still a very strong sense of originality. It's something which, if you didn't know where it came from, you'd never know where it came from, and it defines itself as such. And then another independent maker, MB&F, Maximilien Bousset, used to be the director of Harry Winston, but he had his own desire, he had his own dream to create his own brand. Every watch that they make is very much out of the ordinary, has a very different philosophy behind it. This particular one is made with an Irish watchmaker called Stephen McGonigal at the bottom. The idea was to make a Quantium Perpetual like no other Quantium Perpetual that had ever been made. When a large company makes a Quantium, they design it in such a way that it can be used in the widest number of movements possible. So they tend to make it quite small, they make it as slim as they can, and it becomes something which can be generic throughout a whole series of watches. This is completely opposed to that concept. There was no limit in the amount of thickness which was available, and it was actually the thickness of the watch which really lends to the whole originality of it. The balance is placed above it. The mechanism for all of the Quantium Perpetual is below, and the balance, this balance alone, the balance staff, I've never seen anything quite like it. I think it's close to 12 millimeters in thickness, which is something like 3 times the thickness of some ultra slim watches that are made today. But it is quite an extraordinary timepiece. Because there was no limit in relation to the amount of thickness in the actual construction, you have these extraordinary racks made of up to 15 different components within them. They're sculptures. Do you need to make them like this? No, you don't. But by the time they're actually finished, they are individual pieces of art, from my perspective. And again, an explosion, just showing an array of the different components. Another section in the site is called Just Movements. This is a section which isn't necessarily associated to a brand or a complete watch. They are examples of calibers that have been made during history. It could be early history, or it can be more recent. This is a verge movement. This is really where it began. This is going back to the 18th century. This is effectively a miniaturization of an early church clock. You have the escapement, which is over here, which is called a verge. It is a fusee, which is on the side here, which again has been reproduced in recent years as something which is obscure. But when this was made, all early pocket watches had the same system. Earlier, you saw the Rolex, which was a Valjoux 23. Then there was the Valjoux 23. Now you see something else. This is the same basic caliber, but it's an evolution of it. It is called the 88. So all of the basic mechanism, all of the chronograph remains the same, except you have a full calendar mechanism which was placed here. And again, in the site, I go through and I deconstruct it, and I explain and show everybody how all those elements actually work. Following the pillar wheel, you had the cam system, as we saw with the early Omega. And this was another Valjoux caliber, which was made in volume. Very reliable, very accurate, but a very simple cam system, which is at the end. But one of the things which is interesting about it, and this was made in the 1960s and 1970s, is that the overall proportions that you have with a huge barrel at the back, a third of the watch would have been the escapement, the train, and then the final third would have actually been in proportion with the balance, is something which has existed for literally hundreds of years. That's how all early pocket watches were actually made, and that's what they introduced into this timepiece. It was made in a very different way. It was made for mass production. There's no real finishing. Everything was simplified to the hilt. Another unusual caliber, the caliber itself, the 2391, was a caliber that was made in hundreds and hundreds of thousands. But this is something which I've only ever seen before in textbooks, which is the balance. It was made in the late 1940s. In the late 1940s, there was a movement to find systems to shock protect the pivots of a balance staff. The pivots of a balance staff can be as thin as 0.10 of a millimeter. When a watch was dropped, they would inevitably break. The military used to actually employ watchmakers because watches were being broken all the time, so they would be constantly changing the balance staffs. In the late 1940s, there were inventions called Incablock and KIF, and these systems would actually protect the balance pivots from being broken. This was one of the lesser successful systems that was actually experimented with. And it's something which is a real obscure execution. The concept was, if the watch was actually dropped, the S-shaped arms and the balance would actually take the impact so that it would actually protect the pivots. It wasn't good for isochronism. It was contrary to the way a balance should be made, with all the mass being on the outside of the balance wheel. But it's a curiosity. And again, it shows how different ideas were actually experimented with. Modern calibers. Now, for many, many years, the only way anybody could really be a watchmaker, rather make watches, is if you were a large brand. And then with the advent of independent watchmakers, and all of the change of technology, the development of CNC, CAD, which became more friendly to a wider group of people, and all of the different technology, which meant anybody could, in essence, make components, you had the birth of independent watchmakers. From Daniel Roth to Frank Muller, then to Richard Mille, MB&F, and all of these different companies, they're very much there because of the facility allowed by modern technology to manufacture, as well as the ability to be able to communicate with a wide group of people through social media, through the web, and also fundamentally being able to take pictures of watches with digital photography easily and quickly, again, to be able to transmit what you're actually making. Now, today, if you are a brand, or even if you're an individual, you can make a watch. This is a company called Volsche. Volsche are the company that makes for all of the simple calibers for Richard Mille. They're partly owned by Hermes. They are officially the manufacturer of Parmigiani. But as an individual, and I've done this myself, you can actually go to them and you can use their calibers. You can actually tailor them to your own needs, to your own desire, to your own style. And that is something which is really very much of today. Normally, this is something which was unheard of, and it's something which is probably in the region of about 10 years old in relation to the availability for any individual, any company, to be able to produce their own high-quality caliber. It's a micro rotor. Quite often companies would use micro rotors with the goal to keep the watch as thin as possible. Conventionally, a rotor would go in the center, it would go on the top, but this would then increase the thickness of the watch. By fixing it or setting it into the case, into the movement, it would then mean that you can keep it thin. And this is something like 4 millimeters in thickness, this watch, maybe even less. Another element which is nice from a technical point is this is the mass, which winds up the mainspring. The ball race is actually integrated directly into the pinion, and all of the actual balls or the beads are made in ceramic, which means that they are very, very slippery. They don't require any kind of lubrication, and they are more effective actually at winding the watch up. When you remove the main plates, you see the assembly of all of the pieces within. This is the automatic mechanism. This is the going train. This is the balance cock and the balance. And in the same way that with companies like Rolex, they do not use an index to be able to adjust the balance spring, this is also a free sprung balance. So the way this watch is actually adjusted is by altering the position of the mass slots, which are actually fixed onto the balance wheel. This is the same caliber. The caliber on it is a flying tourbillon. So when you turn this watch over, you have a tourbillon on the other side, which supported and pivoted in these ball races. The reason I have the slide here is to show two very different types of watchmaking. The one on the left is very traditional. The designs are the same, but all of the bridges are made from German silver. They're all decorated, and then they are rhodium plated. The one on the right, however, all of the bridges are made in titanium. All of the black bridges are made in titanium, and then they have a PVD finish, something which is very synonymous with like modern, high-tech, technological watchmaking of today. And then to give contrast, the bridge for the actual tourbillon here is made from 18-karat gold. So it shows how you can have a basic caliber and then make two entirely different products, which have different styles, which have different feelings about them. Another company that does the same thing today, much smaller numbers, far less well-known, is Schwartz-Etienne. The movement on the left and the one in the center is actually the same caliber, but on the left is their own brand. And when they use that caliber under their own brand, all of the angling is made by hand, everything is finished. They've altered all of the forms of the bridges. They've even altered the balance to follow their own specific design. However, you can effectively take this caliber, and it's modular. This has two barrels. This is actually the same caliber, but an automatic version of it. And you can take that movement and you can redesign it. Everything that I've shown you, everything is technical. Nothing, however, would exist if it wasn't for the people who were behind it, behind the product. So on the site, you have a section called People. And there are 12 questions which are posed. It's always the same 12 questions which are posed to people who are players in the business. They are from, okay, so you have Grobel and Forsey, Stephen Forsey and Robert Grobel from the brand Grobel Forsey. Martin Frey, who is a designer, as is Eric Giraud. Felix, who is also a watchmaker. At the top, you have Martin Peters, who is the teacher, the director of WOSTEP. Gregory Ponce, at the top right, who is one of the most controversial but very informed journalists in Switzerland. And this gentleman here is actually a collector. So these questions are posed to all of these different individuals. They all have the same questions, but everybody's different. They have different experiences in life, so they give different answers. The questions are such as, how did you become who you are? What kind of advice would you give to somebody who would want to do the same thing as you? And all the way forward to, where do you view the industry to be in 10 years' time? So these are the people who actually create the industry that we live in today. Another element of the site, another category, is called art. Now, my own photography on all the deconstructions is very basic, it's very simple, and is untouched. Now, professional photography, really the highest level, is extremely difficult to effect. And this section is monopolized by a guy called Guy Luca de Pellouin. Guy Luca is one of the best photographers that I've ever met. He proves that it's not simply about having a good camera or know how to take a macro picture, but there's an art, it's an art form. So there are sections. This is a cage that he's photographed from the Gronefelds. This is from Vianney Halter. This is Laurent Ferrier, Carrie Voutilainen. And he's photographed, this is Ballois. All of these pictures are very much the best examples, the highest quality technical as well as I think on a beauty level that you can find in watchmaking. Debutune. This is very unusual. This is case engelbart. This is what happens when you give a tourbillon to an engraver, and he does whatever he wants to do with it. It's almost, it looks a little bit as if he stuck it in a vat of acid and it's just been eaten away. But that's taken months to actually make. He has filed, engraved, and he's altered the entire structure of the watch to make something which is completely original, completely unusual. Future plans of the Naked Watchmaker. One is to improve my ability to be able to communicate in front of a large group of people. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for staying awake. The biggest thing is that I need to continue to populate. I've already got quite a lot of material which is actually on the site, but it's presently a one-man band. I have somebody who gives me some support, my wife, in relation to the social media, but everything else I'm doing. So the goal is, the longer-term goal is to turn the Naked Watchmaker into a sort of Wikipedia for watches. If you want to understand more about a product that you have or that you intend buying, then you can go to the site and you could actually understand the internal mechanics of what makes the watch tick. To be able to actually see intrinsically how that product is actually produced. It is not a short project, but then it's something that I've always wanted to do, and I view it as almost like a 10-year project. And in the future, I'm hoping that I'll actually have support from other people and even companies who will actually give me material, or I will work with, to be able to populate the site. Okay. That's in relation to the individual products. Recently, I did a study using Volche Manufacturer, and there is now a section on the site which is called Making. And the Making actually explains every section involved in producing a watch on an industrial level. Everything from the idea, the conception, the development, the laboratories of all the testing, the tool shops that actually goes through and actually has to make all the different jigs and components, which are then used in turn to manufacture the pieces of the watch. There are processes which are mind-boggling. There is one, in Volche, there is one step of the manufacture where a woman is employed, or an individual is employed, to ensure that a special treatment has actually been executed correctly on every component. And that person's job is to take a drop of oil, place it on a piece of metal, and make sure that it remains in a globule. If it doesn't remain in a globule, it means that the actual process of protecting that particular component hasn't been made. These kind of processes, there are 100 of them in every manufacturer, in the process of producing every watch. Undermaking is begun. So you have one section of it there. And it goes from the conceptualizing all the way through to making balances, making escapements, making balance springs, through to the final assembly and the checking and the control of the final watches. Another element which I'm going to add in the future is the real basics, is how, not how things are made, but how do they actually work. There will also be a section coming out in about 2 months, which will actually have books, and there will be ebooks. Everything that is on the site today is very basic. There can be up to 125 pictures, and I give a brief explanation of all of the different components and the things to look out for, but it's only part of the story. So in the books which will come in the future, it'll go into much more detail, and it will explain all of the idiosyncrasies of all the different components, of the different calibers, and it will go to another level. Recently, okay, as soon as the site came out, people started asking other things. So I've just now added another section, which is for museums. So anybody who wants to find out more about watchmaking, there are certain key collections to see around the world. Presently, there is Switzerland, England, and a little bit in America, which is on the site. And in the future, that will become more populated as well. So again, whether it's looking to find out about a watch or a collection, there should be a reference section within the site. Okay. Where is he? A mutual friend of yours. Marc-André Deschaux. He has a company called Watches TV in Switzerland. And in December, we made our first collaboration together. We've effectively partnered together. Mark, he makes videos. He's very well known in Asia, and he's pretty much has a monopoly when it comes to actually making videos on the watch industry. And we are working together making deconstructions which are filmed. So the very first piece is the one which you see here. It should be released at the end of this week. And it will actually show, I actually deconstruct the watch. He films the whole thing. We add pictures from my static deconstructions to be able to show all the different components so that people can get really inside of the timepieces, to be able to understand in a much more dynamic, in a more visual way, how all the different pieces are actually made. As with all sites, we're becoming more active on social media. So you will see elements of all the deconstructions on Instagram and Facebook. And again, this is why I have to improve what I'm doing today. Part of what I do is to try to transmit and directly. So my first lecture was in QP in London back in last November. December. When was it? I can't remember. I'm here today. This is my second. I excuse myself. And in the future, there will be other lectures around the world as well. And another element is that, and this is probably one of the most complicated and one of the most interesting for me, is that everything that is on the website is going to be translated into apps, and those apps are going to be made in Mandarin and in Japanese. So all this information, which is now pretty much uniquely found in English, will then actually be communicated in other languages. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel like a bit of a clown because I really haven't actually prepared this very well. I thought I did, but as I'm actually presenting, I realize I haven't done. Thank you for your patience. That is actually the end of the presentation. So thank you. Okay. I was going to say, does anybody have any questions? Because I'd be really grateful at this point if they did.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much indeed for your time and for your presentation. At least personally, I think it was fantastic. So, very well prepared.
I like you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, you haven't heard my question yet. You've clearly seen an incredible variety of watches. And at the bench, I felt for a very, very long time that the nuts and bolts of watchmaking aren't necessarily difficult until you bump into a problem or you make a mistake. So I wonder if you can share briefly perhaps what the most clever or brilliant restoration or fix that you've seen in an antique watch, or conversely, from the name of the site, the most salacious or dirty secret that you've seen in a current production watch that has surprised you.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for warning me beforehand. When it comes to restoration, okay, honestly, the best restorations are those where you have no idea what was done in the first place. And the art of restoration is to restore something sympathetically so that nobody's even aware that you've actually been there. Many years ago, I was contacted by, okay, I'm going to go off at a tangent, but I'm going to do it anyway. I was contacted by a lady called Nancy Burkett. Nancy Burkett was one of the remaining daughters of one of the directors of JP Morgan. And she contacted me through Sotheby's in this fair city. And what she had was she had a Frodsham. Each one of those directors at the period was given one of these Frodsham. It was a minute repeater, split-second tourbillon pocket watch. It was a huge thing. And that watch landed on my bench, and there were 12 made at the time. And there was a flood in California, which is where she was living, and our job was to actually take that watch and to be able to reconstruct it so that you would never know. And we did it. I actually had everybody in my workshop at the time working on it, not because they needed to, but I wanted them to be part of what was something was, for me, historical. Some of them thought that I was a complete idiot, that I actually wanted everybody to be involved. Maybe I'm a little bit romantic. But we went through and we restored that piece, and by the time it was finished, you would never have known. And that is the magic of actually really being a restorer. When it comes to the most clever, it's such an open question. If you want to look at the highest quality watches made today, which probably are better when it comes purely to finishing, and also beauty, at least from my perspective, if you look at a company like Global 4C, they have really taken quality and complexity, and they've taken it onto another level. But at the same time, you have product which starts at whatever, 300,000, 500,000, and it goes up to $1 million+. Incredible stuff. But as much as I love and respect them, and they've participated in this as well with the interviews, when you look at something like those Volche calibers, now I've been working with Volche on and off for nearly 17 years. They were my very first client when I became self-employed in 2000. I used to build minute repeaters for them. So I do have a certain bias towards them. But when you see how they produce what is effectively a high-quality, mass-produced caliber, it's really brilliant, because one of the beautiful things about those calibers is that they are as easy to put together as they are to take apart. And the simplicity and the overall holistic thinking about not only how do you make a product which looks good, which works well, which is of a certain size, but how is it going to act in the future? How are watchmakers in the future going to be able to manipulate it, to be able to take it apart, put it together? There's no rocket science behind it. There are companies who have made product which is far less, but is much more complicated. And that hasn't really given a thought into the future. Recently, I was speaking to some watchmakers who were involved in I think it's called the Project 51, the mechanical swatch. I don't know that, but they were talking, is that right? The System 51. Now, I had no idea what this thing really is, but they were talking about it with incredible reverence. I think from what I understand, it's a disposable timepiece at the end of the day, okay? But it's mechanical, and there are elements of genius or incredible originality in all levels. It's not just a Global 4C, which costs $1 million, or a Volche, which maybe sells for 50 or 60, or can be a lot less. It's really, there's so much originality on every level. And one of the things which is the most challenging, I think today, and what you begin to see more, is the idea of luxury in a lot of people's minds is just like prices of watches which are not comparable to the actual innate quality within them. Today, the idea of value is actually increasing. So you actually have to get more for your money because the competition is so intense. And that is bringing into the market really funky, affordable, but really nice quality pieces. There's a Kuala Lumpur designer, photographer, a guy called Ming, M-I-N-G, okay? Who's heard of Ming? There's a lot of watch people here. Okay. Ming is actually, he's an incredible guy. He spent a lot of time working with Hasselblad, and he's a photographer. But he wanted to make watches. He started off with a fairly inexpensive watch, I think it was like $900 or something like that. And then recently, he partnered and he made a series of watches with the company, which is, I've noted here, which is Schwartz-Etienne. And it is the double barrel piece which is shown there, but they've completely changed it. It's an existing caliber, but it's beautiful. They've taken something which is kind of like standard and then taken it out of the ordinary. And that is one of the wonderful things about watchmaking. This comes back to your question. There's no one answer. And I could just keep on coming out with other examples. There are so many which are like that. And it's on every level. My pleasure.
Anyone else?
Okay, she's from the industry, so I don't want to talk to her. Okay, but
it's going to be very romantic.
Now
question.
or later?
No.
Okay.
If you had a time machine and you could go back in time, horological time, where would you like to land?
Wow.
I told you it was a nice question.
Wow.
But with clothes on.
With clothes on, yeah, I would. Okay, it's a really probably a boring answer. Okay, but if you go back to the early part of the 19th century, you have the life of Breguet. Breguet historically has this reputation of being like the most extraordinary watchmaker of all time. And when you look at what he made, it's validated, not just as the creator of the tourbillon, but he did so many different things. He made, or rather his brand made, I think called the Sympathique, I think it was called. It was like, basically it was a clock. It came with a pocket watch. Some years ago, the Breguet as a company made the same thing, but with a wristwatch. And you take the pocket watch or the wristwatch, and then at the end of the day, you would slide it into the clock, and the clock would then wind it up and it would set it. The reason I would go back to that period is actually not because of Breguet as an individual, but I think that the company was probably an extraordinary company, and there's no way that one person had all of those ideas. The company grew very quick. I think he as an individual was probably an incredible entrepreneur who would have surrounded himself with incredible people. And I would love to be able to go inside of that company and actually, in the same way that I did it with Vaucher or with Schwartz-Etienne or these other companies, but to see how they work, how they function, to see those people, to be able to talk with them, to eat with them, to drink with them. Because I think that would be fascinating. Because what they did back then was extraordinary. It's okay? Okay.
Is that it?
Okay.
It seems like these days there's more content that goes inside not just independents but brands, how they do things than ever, right? There's the kind of secrets that have been kept forever coming out. Do you think that there's a problem with brands, like going forward with this project, do you think that secrets and ego could harm information coming out, or do you think that this is kind of the dawn of an era when all these secrets are becoming shared?
Companies can't hide anything today. I mean, it's just not possible. There are, for example, journalists who are based in Singapore who know more about the Swiss industry as a whole than the actual industry knows about themselves. It's because of the interest, it's because of the internet, it's because of the culture that we're living in today. It's all associated to, it's all associated basically to the technology. It is going to continue. You cannot afford, and I've seen companies who say something is Swiss made and it's made in Japan. Or they say that it's their caliber and then suddenly you discover it's made by another company. It all gets out. There is more knowledge outside of the industry today than there ever has been. So I think it's an inevitability that that people will become more informed and the industry has to become more and more transparent. And that's a good thing. The negative element of it is that then sometimes a little knowledge can be a very dangerous thing or a bad thing. At the end of the day, it's always subjective. And you have a company like Richard Mille that works with Volche manufacturer as well as Renault and Papi, and they do produce their own things, but they produce the majority with these other companies. So is that good or is that bad? And it's neither, because Mille goes into a company like Volche, takes a basic caliber and completely transforms it. But that's a point of view. There are other companies who have a brand. They'll go into, whether it's they get an ETA caliber or a Piguet caliber or whatever, another caliber, and then they just say it's theirs, they do nothing to it, and then that's kind of a travesty. That's not real. So there's going to be a lot of shades of gray along the road. And maybe that's the good thing why, I mean, there's the Naked Watchmaker, there's other sites. I'm not the only person doing this. I'm just doing it in a different way today. So it is a new period. And I think it will bring greater, maybe honesty, but it'll bring conflict along the way as well. Because it's very easy to criticize if you don't actually fully understand the products that you're actually looking at. Does that answer? Thank you very much. There was a hand at the back.
Thank you for your presentation. You've been definitely restoring very exquisite timepieces. In the last 5 years or so, has there been any difference between customers requesting a restoration or a preservation?
Okay, so I left restoration now a long time ago. I left the restoration world in 1996. But there is always an argument, or there are always two sides. There's restoration or preservation. Restoration is the concept that you take a timepiece and you return it to what it would have been like right at the very beginning. Preservation is that you keep it as it is today. So if you, for example, look at, if I go to, okay, so, this is a 1950s Rolex chronograph. The case was never water resistant, and the dial is completely tarnished. The omega that I have is actually the same. That has been preserved, opposed to being restored. Again, it's a subjective thing. When I was working in London, what we would often do is that we would restore. Because the thing that defined the products that we sold at that moment in time was that they were immaculate and they were as the original. But if they were restored, you could still see that they were restored. Because a dial which was immaculate from a watch which was maybe 75 years old, it couldn't have gone through life unless it was in a safe the whole period of time and never been touched. It would never end up like that. I think you have collectors who like it when it's completely original, but in perfect state, which is very difficult, but then that's why the watches then can command very high prices. But it's a personal thing. And I'm not really part of that world anymore, so I don't know what the tendency is. What I do know is that if you do have a vintage piece and it is immaculate and it isn't restored, it commands a much higher price than a piece which is either restored or which has been slightly tarnished. But again, it varies on what the models are, what the brands are, and the final clients. So I'm afraid I can't really give you an answer more precise than that. Anybody else?
I'm going to be greedy and ask two.
It's actually easier answering questions than giving the presentation, so feel free.
Is there anything that you deeply, deeply, deeply hope that you get to see and take apart that you've never had the opportunity to? And the word grail gets thrown around, and I wonder what yours is.
You know, I was asked about a grail watch a while ago, and my grail watch as an individual timepiece was probably that Frodsham complication, which was with the whole Nancy Burkett story behind it. But recently, and this was all part of the process for the reference section for the museums, I went to the British Museum in London. And in the British Museum in London, they have a student's room. They have upstairs, they have all the presentation, which is actually very funky and it's very nice. But it's very small. Then they have a student's room. In the student's room, they have drawers full of watches and movements and pocket watches, 4,000 examples of pieces down there. And I don't have a desire for any one watch, but I'm trying to gain access into the student's room to be able to actually go through those drawers. Normally you have to go in there and say, I want this period, this particular brand, this kind of piece, this kind of mechanism, and then the curators will actually go through and they'll actually find for you what you're looking for. I just want freedom. I want to go into that place and then just be left alone. That is really what I want to do. When I went in there, that was at the same time as going to this QP exhibition. They had pieces on the first level and movements which really reminded me of why I became infected by this watchmaking disease in the first place. There were calibers there which I normally can look at any movement and I know what it is, I know where it came from, I know what the mechanism is, I can analyze it very, very quickly. But there were calibers there with masses of levers and racks, and I didn't know if these things were QPs or what kind of sonories they were, but they were incredible. And they were, again, pieces which came from the 19th century. And beautifully made, beautifully executed, beautifully designed. And that's where I came from. That's where I fell in love with restoration. I started off getting into watchmaking because I was a 17-year-old, had no direction. And the idea with watchmaking was that if you become a watchmaker, you can get a job anywhere, therefore you can travel. And I always wanted to travel. That was one of my sort of childhood dreams. That was something which really pushed me into watchmaking. Then I got involved into watchmaking, and I became quite good at it from a very early stage. It was when I went into restoration that I went from being good and liking something to actually falling in love with it and starting to photograph things and really going further into it than anybody else that was around me. And I had, in the modern watch world, to a degree, I lost that. Even in Renault & Papi, which was an amazing company, and we made these incredible complications, there was I lost the romance, I lost the love. Then I started doing my own watches, and then my own creativity kind of rekindled it. And now, when I go back into these early pocket watches and these early wristwatches, I'm reminded of why I became sick in the first place. And I would really, and I'm going to push at it, and I'm going to try to gain access to that student's room. And if anybody goes to London, go there. You just have to call them beforehand. You can go down, and if you have any kind of preference of something, or just go down there and have a look around, because it's absolutely fascinating. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Gentleman in the front row.
In this context, is there one outstanding watch museum which you can recommend?
I haven't been to all of them. I can't give you one, but I'll give you three. Okay, the science, and it's all London at this moment in time. The Science Museum in London is wonderful, more towards marine chronometry. One of my favorite museums is actually the Albert and Victoria, and you can't take any pictures, but it's very diverse. And then the British Museum, but not so much for what's on the ground floor, but really for what is actually hidden in the student's room. Sorry, I'm going to give you another one now as well. The last one would be in Switzerland, and it's in Le Chaux-de-Fonds. And it's a wonderful museum, which is actually, the actual building itself is a work of art, and it's all basically subterranean. And if you go through that one, you also have a very wide diversity of things. But I think there are many more, and I think even in Germany, there's like 50 different collections which you can go to visit as well. If you go to one place, go to London, and in London you have great diversity. Oh, another nice one is actually the observatory. But there isn't one. There's just examples in different places, so you just have to go and visit all of them if you're kind of sick like I am when it comes to watchmaking. Okay, my pleasure. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month. I believe the date is February 5th. Jack Forster, editor-in-chief of Hodinkee, is lecturing that night. See you then. Have a great night.